precisely with the subject of our long-range report on affordable housing in Portland. We'll examine the issue from the perspectives of our expert panel, including Stephen Rudman, Executive Director of the Housing Authority of Portland, Susan Emmons, Executive Director of the Northwest Pilot Project, and Erik Sten, Commissioner for the City of Portland. But first, some announcements, and I will keep these short. The first one is rather sad. We learned this week of the passing of longtime City Club member Alan Hart, who died last Saturday at the grand old age of 92. Alan was a member of the City Club for 56 years. During his tenure, he served as president, research board chair, and was a member of several research board committees. He received the City Club's award for service to the club and the community, and just last year, the club named its long-term research award in his honor. Our thoughts are with his family and friends, and he will surely be missed by all of us. Join us next Friday, February the 15th, for a special program about an innovative new program for dealing with Portland Public Schools facilities. Our speakers will be Mark Abrams, member of the school board, Steve Janik, board member of the newly formed Portland Public Schools Real Estate Trust, and Ruth Scott, president of Innovation Partnerships, and that'll be here at the MAC. In the center of your tables, you'll find information to assist you in participating in our 2-month membership campaign. Between now and March 31st, we hope to add 100 new members. Each of you can help by completing one of those forms on the center of the table, making your pledge to recruit 2 members and returning it to the club office. Non-members, you get off lightly. You need only sign yourselves up. Fill out a membership application form today. Our member host today is Clyde Doctor, whom you have already met, our Affordable Housing Study, chair of our Affordable Housing Study Committee. He will ask the first question of our speakers. Following Clyde's question, we'll open the program to questions from City Club members in the audience. Please be ready with your question and make them both searching and concise so that we can make the most of our distinguished panel's wisdom. Broadcast of City Club programs this quarter is made possible in part by corporate underwriting from Enterprise Rent-A-Car, from Pacific Care, and from the Weyerhaeuser Company Foundation, and we're most grateful for their support. And now to our panel, and I'll keep these introductions very brief. The report notes how far ahead of the game we are in Portland in affordable housing, and as you'll hear from our speakers, you'll get an inkling of that. Steve Rudman was appointed Executive Director of the Housing Authority of Portland last year, beating a field of 70 other applicants, I might say. Before that, he was director of the Portland Bureau of Housing and Community Development for the City of Portland for 9 years. He's also a lecturer at PSU's School of Urban Studies. Susan Emmons has been executive director of the Northwest Pilot Project for 17 years. She's emerged as a leading advocate for affordable housing and for the homeless. City Commissioner Erik Sten is no stranger to City Club audiences and is well known to you as an advocate for affordable housing. In 2000, he helped found Oregon Home, a coalition of elected officials, housing advocates, private sector developers, seniors, and religious groups to address affordable housing problems statewide. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our distinguished panel.
Good afternoon. It's very nice to be here. And first, I'd just like to compliment the committee who did a tremendous public service tackling this difficult subject with some comprehensive and thoughtful analysis. We can see by the vote just how difficult of an issue it is. There's no easy answers. It's also a privilege for me to be on this panel with the other panelists. Our problems in Portland would be a lot worse if it wasn't for the efforts of elected leaders like Erik Sten, who followed in the footsteps of Gretchen Kafori and had the political will and courage to tackle this issue. And then there's Susan Emmons, who's probably one of the most effective affordable housing advocates in the country, as you will soon see. I'm going to spend a couple of minutes talking about the context, both nationally and locally. Affordable housing issues really is a critical public policy issue that warrants a lot of attention. First, the need is very large, as the report says. Decent and affordable shelter is a very basic need, just like food. It's hard for a person to focus on other needs if this need is unmet. Housing is also a critical component of stable and healthy communities. When housing needs go unmet, we have cycles of poverty, crime, and other social ills, and none of us want. At the same time, as the club report indicates, it's a very invisible and complex issue. people doubling up and paying exorbitant amount of their rents, it's not as easily understood as issues such as student performance or even some of the environmental issues that we tackle. Affordable housing needs to become more important in terms of public policy discussions. As you listen to the panel today, I hope all of you will play whatever role you can in your leadership position in the community. For those of you who are already involved, I say thanks. This is very difficult work. It's very important work. First, a very brief background on the Housing Authority of Portland. It was founded in 1941, has a rich 60-year history as an independent public corporation, which now serves all of Multnomah County, including the city of Gresham. Our purpose is housing, help, and hope for all. We're governed by a 9-member citizen volunteer commission appointed by local jurisdictions. Several past and present board members are here, and our community owes them a great deal of gratitude for their hard work, unheralded work in leading this organization. The Housing Authority is the largest affordable housing provider in the county, indeed in the state of Oregon. We have 6,000 rental units, including 2,800 public housing units. We also administer what's known as Section 8, or the rent assistance to 7,000 households. All told, about 30,000 people benefit one way or another in our housing. We also have some support programs for residents with other partners, for residents who are elderly and disabled, as well as for families. For example, our GOALS program, our family self-sufficiency program, in the last 5 years, 300 graduates have quadrupled their income, and nearly 100 of those have become homeowners and been able to move out of public and assisted housing. We are the primary channel for local federal funds. Our $71 million budget has about 70% federal funds. I wanted to give you a quick snapshot about federal funding, because in my opinion, localities cannot supplant the role of the federal government. A factoid in the report is in the year 2000, the federal government budget was about $124 billion on housing subsidies. $97 billion of those subsidies was for the mortgage interest and property tax deductions for homeowners. It's called foregone revenue. Only 21%, or $27 billion, was for rental assistance and neighborhood development, coming mainly through the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, known as HUD. So that $97 billion is for middle and upper income people who own their homes. Indeed, 2/3 of that subsidy went to households at 120% and above median. In Portland, for a family of 4 in our metropolitan area, that's about $64,000 for those families and above. At the same time, nationally, we have 13 million families with critical housing needs who spend more than 50% of their income on housing. And only a fraction are supported with direct federal assistance. Despite incremental increases, federal support for low-income housing has actually decreased in real-time dollars with inflation since the Nixon administration. Clearly, incremental funding is inadequate to meet today's housing needs. I'm not advocating for reduction in home ownership subsidies. But what we need to do is kind of think of a more balanced and fair way to allocate total resources in this country. Adequate resources are needed for rental housing. Indeed, rental subsidies are the most direct way to help. But $27 billion on the one hand, $97 billion on the other would be a huge, huge federal commitment. The club report recognized this, but the reality is this is an incredibly difficult task, particularly with the competing priorities today with national security and economic decline. But the issue is the federal role is absolutely critical. With insufficient federal funds, local governments have been left trying to fill the gap. Portland has done as well as any city in the country in exploring new approaches. In 1990, there were 3 broad housing goals the city had. 1, to capture 20% of the metropolitan area growth through incentives to increase density in our neighborhoods. 2, to revitalize distressed neighborhoods in the inner city that were marked then by thousands of vacant and abandoned buildings. And 3, to increase the supply of affordable housing for very low-income residents. Well, with market forces, we did pretty well with 1 and 2, the dynamics of the marketplace changing in the last decade. But the last one, increasing the supply, has been so difficult as prices have increased that our production agenda has become a preservation agenda. To do any of this, the city had to come up with all kinds of tools: zoning incentives, tax abatements, fee waivers, foreclosed property donations, grants and loans from federal funds, tax increment funds, and even city general funds. Local leaders are still working hard to find new solutions, and I'm sure Eric will talk about some of that in a few minutes. Also, a cadre of a solid group of for-profit and especially nonprofit affordable housing developers have become very sophisticated in tapping all kinds of support that's available, tax credits, bonds, and the grants and loans that I mentioned. The club report talks about how confusing and expensive it is to have these multiple layers of subsidies. It is a dizzying array. It's not the most efficient way, but currently it is the American way. Now we need to look at rent assistance in our community since it is a central issue in the City Club report. For the most part, Section 8 vouchers are given to people rather than to properties. Fair market rents are set based on bedroom size. An individual pays 30% of their adjusted gross income, and the vouchers pay the rest. This gives renters the greatest freedom of choice. In Portland and Multnomah County, we actually have 3,000 landlords who do voluntarily accept vouchers. We do have a huge waiting list, but HAP's rental assistance program does serve mostly those in greatest need. Over 98% of the 7,000 households in the program have incomes of less than 50% of median income. That means $26,000 or below for a family of 4. Almost 40% are disabled, 10% are elderly, groups that often have limited ability to become more self-sufficient. That's how the program works today. As Clyde mentioned, there is some new proposals that we are exploring to basically make more vouchers available for properties. They're called project-based vouchers, as well as vouchers that support home ownership. The authorization lets local housing authorities have up to 20% of their vouchers for these programs. We did a lot of outreach and found a lot of support for project-based vouchers, and we're moving forward in a pilot project that within a few years we could have as many as 1,500 project-based vouchers annually in our community. What are the benefits of project-based? Well, it helps the people who have the hardest time finding housing, people who have special needs or who have credit or criminal history problems in their past. Also, owners could use this as a way to get a steady income stream that they can help finance property development. By combining rent assistance with the other tools, you can serve lower income. This basically is a version of what the City Club's report is trying to say. Finally, I want to just touch one other issue, the deconcentration of poverty, which is playing out nationally as an emphasis on building mixed income communities and especially revitalizing existing public housing. There's been absolutely no new public housing built in this country since 1994. However, considerable support has been directed to revitalizing public housing. Most of this comes through something called a Hope 6 grant. You see pictures about the implosion of the big towers, vertical towers in the east and midwest of our country to make up for the failed experiments of several decades ago. Our conditions are a whole lot different in Portland, but we were awarded a $35 million Hope 6 grant to transform the 70-acre Columbia Villa development of 450 public housing units in North Portland. By the time this project is complete, we will have integrated what is today a very isolated community into the surrounding area, which is a healthy idea for a number of reasons. We're going to create a mixed income community of 850 units that combines conventional public housing with affordable rental housing, market rate rental housing, and home ownership opportunities. It's taken partnership at all levels of government and the community to make this happen. All told, it'll be about $150 million investment or more that will bring new vital life to North Portland. It will also do so without driving low-income residents away from the community they call home. All of our very low-income units will be replaced either on-site or off-site. It's a very exciting vision, and we invite you to participate in making this dream come true. In closing, we got a basic dilemma here. Affordable housing, if you look at the issue in terms of needs and do a needs-based analysis, you come to some conclusions. On the other hand, policymakers, decision makers need to deal with available resources. You're going to have conflicts, you're going to have compromises and difficult choices. We do need to be smarter and more efficient when we combine available resources today. More importantly, we need to continue to seek solutions at the local, metro, state, and especially federal levels of government. Affordable housing and an adequate supply is a very important public policy issue, but it's one of the most difficult to rally support and involvement around because the need is so vast and it's largely invisible to those who are in a position to influence outcomes. We need more public dialogue and debate on various courses open to us. It is the perceived disinterest on the part of the public that has made it so hard to make this a national priority. and the Housing Authority of Portland and I look forward to working with you on this critical challenge. Thank you.
12 blocks from here, an 84-year-old man named Jack lives in one room in a residential hotel. The bathroom he shares with the other rooms on his floor is down the hall. There's a bare light bulb in Jack's ceiling and a cord to light that bulb. And when you pull that cord, you hear the sound of rain, and it's the sound of cockroaches scattering. Jack's a World War II veteran. He lives on his veteran's pension of $796 a month. He pays $480 a month for this one room in this residential hotel. There's a 2-story, 4-bedroom house by the Lloyd Center. A husband and wife who are architects inherited some money and wanted to do something for affordable housing and wanted to buy this house and turn it into housing for families. They approached me because they were worried about the families that they might possibly displace, that would be displaced while they did the renovation. And I said, well, how many families are we talking about? And they said, well, we don't want to get anybody into trouble. And they took me to see this house, and in this house that was meant to have 2 families on the lease, there were 7 families living in this house. And by the time we got to the attic, there was a clothesline across this attic with a blanket over the clothesline to provide privacy for the 2 families living up there. And I have to say, it looked like something out of the Diary of Anne Frank. Recently, I had lunch with an 86-year-old woman named Ruth. We had helped her to find housing 4 years ago. Although I treated her to a modest lunch, she ate sparingly and asked me if I would be offended if she took the rest of her lunch home. Now, this is a woman who has a good appetite, like me, and likes to eat. And so I was worried about this, and I asked her if something was wrong. And she said in a very straightforward way, I can make another meal out of this. And I asked her what was going on, and she said, well, my Social Security went up January 1st by $18 a month, but my rent went up $30 a month. I'm paying more for my prescriptions. My supplemental health insurance goes up. There's really nowhere I can cut back except for on my food expense. On any given weekday morning, as you approach the office of Northwest Pilot Project, you will see elderly women and men standing outside of our door. The building that we have our office space in opens at 8 o'clock. I usually arrive at 7:30, and in cold, rainy weather, people standing on our sidewalk. They're standing out there because we have a limited number of slots, and they want to be first on the list to get one of these precious housing slots. We help people with affordable housing that is affordable to them that are age 50 and over in this community, and every day we are turning people away in record numbers. Our fiscal year begins July 1st, like many nonprofits. In July, August, and September of last year, first 3 months of our fiscal year, we turned away 284 people. And that was more than we turned away in the entire previous years. And in 17 years of doing this work, I have to say this is the worst I've ever seen it, and other agencies that we work with in the community are seeing the same thing. We have a severe shortage of housing affordable to low-income people in our community. The problem is county-wide. The problem affects all age groups. And yes, we've done some wonderful things in our community. We've built some beautiful buildings around the city, but in spite of all this good work, I'm here to tell you today that the problem is worse in 2002 than it was in 1992. In 1992, I was asked to chair the newly created Housing and Community Development Commission, and I chaired this group from 1992 to 1995. I was just thrilled to be asked to do this. I saw it as an opportunity to affect a lot more lives. At Northwest Pilot Project, I knew I could have an impact on 4,000 lives a year. At the Housing and Community Development Commission, I thought we could affect 100,000 lives a year. I thought we would reshape our housing delivery system, and that was our charge, to set public policy, to see that housing dollars were connected to this public policy, and to create a seamless housing delivery system. In 1992, I was very interested in defining the problem and coming up with a solution. I didn't want yet another big plan that would sit on a shelf. I wanted a 10-page document that would be read, that would name the problem and put a price tag on the solution, and we did that. We had the best staff draft that was ever compiled. Kathy Briggs is here today. She was one of them, Mike Saba. And in 1993, we published the Comprehensive Housing Affordability Strategy Update, a 10-page paper that documented we had a shortage of 10,000 rental units countywide for the lowest income families and individuals in our community. The cost of fixing it was $500 million. We researched housing trust funds, and I became convinced that this was the answer. And at that time, I was asked to do a lot of speaking, church groups, community groups like Rotary, Kiwanis, Lions, League of Women Voters, and everywhere I went, I would talk about the drastic shortage of affordable housing we had in the community, and I would talk with great enthusiasm about a housing trust fund being the answer and how we would fund it. And I personally believed we should have done a bond measure then. The economy was strong. Others didn't agree with me. But in essence, the number was too big, $500 million. People looked at it and gasped and said, it's too much. And we flinched. And we didn't do it. And to tell you how seriously I felt about this, and my husband, who's also here today, would tell you the endless meetings, I got a sweatshirt made. When I get really serious about an issue, I get a sweatshirt made. And at that time, we were talking a lot about benchmarks. That was the current buzzword. And my sweatshirt said, my benchmarks are bigger than your benchmarks. A $500 million housing trust fund by 1997, which also gives you an idea of a little bit how naive I was. In 1993, 1997 seemed a long time away, and I thought we could accomplish it, and I thought we could solve it. So now we're in 2002, and the shortage of units for lowest income people in our community has grown from the 10,000 number of 1993 to over 12,000. Our homeless shelters are full to overflowing. We have families doubled up. We have seniors living in substandard housing or being forced to choose between paying their rent and having decent food. We have people paying 60, 70, 80% of their income for rent. This is disgraceful. And it doesn't have to be this way in Portland. We know how to create stable, decent housing that is permanently affordable to people. One example of this is the 12th Avenue Terrace. And it's a beautiful building. It's located at 12th and Market. We spent 7 years advocating for this building. It's 118 studios. It's owned by Reach Community Development. The Housing Authority of Portland has put project-based subsidies into it, so it's affordable to our very lowest income seniors who pay 30% of their income for rent. And I just want to tell you, this housing works. It works well. At Northwest Pilot Project, we follow people over the long term to determine their stability in housing. Our housing placement program shows that 88% of the people we place in housing are still in that housing a year later, 2 years later, 3 years later. Beyond the success rate, it's important to talk about what decent, stable housing allows people to do. And to give a few examples, residents of the 12th Avenue Terrace volunteer in the Smart Reading Program. They usher at the Performing Arts Center. They serve Meals on Wheels. They're active with their churches. There's a transformation for people when they no longer have to worry about their housing. They can become involved citizens in our community. I'm hopeful, very hopeful about our ability to solve this problem because of the people collected in this room today, because of the time and effort and years of work that was put into the report that you reviewed today. As Portlanders, we have a lot to be proud of and some things we still need to be ashamed of. And yet I'm convinced from the speaking I've done that people universally understand how important housing is, and that all of us want to live in a city where everyone has decent housing. And I'd like to end my comments with a brief story. As I had said earlier, in 1993, I was doing a lot of speaking on a housing trust fund. Sometimes these talks would be televised when I didn't even know about it, and they just show up on some station. One day in 1993, late in the year, a package was dropped off at my office for me, and there was a note with this package, and it read, "Dear Director Emmons, I saw you on television and you are right. Everyone deserves housing. When my mom and Timmy and me were in the shelter, we were sad and scared. It was hard to go to school. Things are better now that we have our own apartment. I wanted to come and work with you on the trust fund, but my mom says I'm too young. I'm 9. She said it was okay to give you this. It's all my savings for a bike. Please use it for housing. Your friend Chelsea." And in the package was her World Bank, and it was filled with pennies, nickels, dimes, and quarters totaling $23.74. I can tell you that's a lot of pennies, nickels, and dimes, and quarters. I kept her World Bank. I still have the money. And I always said, if we ever did get a trust fund in our community, a real trust fund, I wanted Chelsea's money to be the first money in. I don't think there's a person in this room today that wants to be the one to tell a 9-year-old that we don't know when we'll have housing affordable to her family, that we don't know within 10 years if we would have housing affordable to her family. And if I could leave you with anything from my comments today, it would be the sense of urgency that I feel about this, and a sense of the possibility that we can solve this problem. We have to work faster. We need to be smarter about the way we do this work. We need to hold each other accountable about whether we're meeting the goals we've set. We need a collective sense of urgency, but most of all, we need more resources. I think Portland's at a fork in the road. I think Portland's a wonderful city. I think it could be a great city. I envision a Portland of the future that has decent housing for all its citizens. And I believe with all my heart that we can make this a reality. It will take all of us in this room and many others working together to make this happen. I'm convinced that Portland's going to be the first city in this country to solve its affordable housing crisis. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, and I do really appreciate the invitation. I'm actually floored at how many people showed up. I agree with Susan's assessment. I wish each of you could parade up here and take a look out around us. I know a lot of people in this room, and if you look at the different disciplines, we actually have enough energy and brains in this room to solve the problem. I believe we can. We've learned a lot in the last 10 years. We've learned that great places like Portland will have housing problems. If you have a great quality of life, you're going to have higher demand and higher prices. There's no way around it. But we have learned how to build good projects, things like the Belmont Dairy that fit in and make a neighborhood better. We have a dedicated community. We've got the country's best housing authority. We've got great for-profit and nonprofit developers, and we know how to do good financing. We've learned and done a great deal in the last 10 years. It's now time, it's been time, it's really time now to incorporate the lessons we've learned, build a workable, structural solution to this problem, and quit treating it like charity. At times, I do think the answer is just to clone Susan, but I'm not sure I'm for human cloning. She's a constant inspiration, and I really, I just can't help but mention it again. But it is time we start thinking differently, and we need to do it together. Housing is not just the right thing to do morally. Done right, and I underline done right, it's good for the economy, it's also good for neighborhoods. Done right, even low-income housing appreciates in value and becomes a community asset. If you look at the current situation, there are two places where our market is failing. There are two noticeable holes. First, there is an acute shortage of housing for the poor. We've talked about that today. The poor are hurting throughout the whole country, just as they are in Portland. And right now, seniors and disabled face almost impossible circumstances. They live on payments of $550 to $700 a month. They can make ends meet if they find a place for $300 a month, which leaves about $10 a day for everything else. The problem is simple. There are not very many places that you can call home for $300. They're the worst off, but they're joined closely by the working poor. The working poor in this community pay way too much percentage of their monthly income for rent, and a lack of affordable housing for working people contributes to all sorts of other costly problems. Poor classroom performance, congestion, crime, health problems, domestic violence are all exacerbated by our housing crisis, and they're costly. The second major failure of our housing market these days is a lack of opportunity for first-time buyers. From 1990 to 2000, our home ownership rate in the region fell during the boom time from 66.5% to 62.1%. During that same period nationally, the home ownership rate was rising from 63.9% to 67.4%. Based on our experience and the experience in other West Coast cities, I think it's a safe bet that without action on our part, that trend will continue. Unless we turn this trend around, it's likely that our home ownership rate will mirror that of San Francisco and fall below 50%. I would not encourage you to become a realtor if that's the future. These market failures, and that's what they are, translate into untapped potential and very negative side effects. It is the role of the government to step in where market failures threaten our general welfare, and that's what we're facing. Government is successful when it does so in a way that paves the way for good private sector solutions, and I think that's what we can do in this town. So what do? We need to give people the tools that they need to make the most of their lives. That's a vibrant economy. Income is an issue. Education, healthcare, and safe, decent, affordable housing. Stable housing means a stable economy. It means people are freed up from stress and uncertainty. It means kids are not bounced from school to school at a time in their life when they need stable friendships and a consistent relationship with their teachers. But of all the things that I just mentioned, the things that people need if they're going to be successful in our society, education, healthcare, a good job, housing is a tangible physical asset. Unlike schools or healthcare equipment, housing does usually increase in value over time. This is very good news, and it's something we haven't paid enough attention to because it creates opportunities to harness the immense power of private sector investment. On a large scale, appreciation makes market-based housing programs possible. Think about the success of the mortgage interest deduction federally, and you'll begin to understand what we should be getting at. We should use that same logic locally. On an individual level, housing is absolutely fundamental to economic success. Homeownership is the strongest vehicle this country has ever had for an average family to create wealth. We're missing a very big opportunity if we can allow this trend to continue and do not make our citizens homeowners. Owning a home means about a $3,000 to $5,000 cut in your taxes, which is a heck of a lot less than anyone got from that $1.3 trillion tax cut last year. How do we do it? After 10 years of working on these issues, I'm absolutely convinced that we can do this in concert with our market economy and find a structural solution. In fact, I think it's the only way. Smart housing programs are good for the economy. They create jobs, and it's not just us leftist politicians. Some of the most sophisticated private sector thinkers in town agree on this argument. Harold Schnitzer, Homer Williams, Doug Oblitz, David Bell have run the numbers, done the economic analysis. It's a fact. Done right, affordable housing is good for the economy. It creates jobs, stability, and community wealth. The solution won't come just through regulation, but it will come by partnering with all phases of the private sector and making the market stronger and plugging those holes, using market savvy. It will happen when our government uses resources effectively to plug those holes in the housing market that I've described. And we must fund those proposals with measures that have a strong nexus to the source of the problem, and then put the money back into the industries, the lending, construction, and real estate that provide housing in this town. Why aren't we doing it? The heart of the matter is we're stuck, and have been for the last few years, if not longer, in silly political fights. Trench warfare, we sound like a broken record. The home builders are arguing that it's the urban growth boundary, or it's government regulation, perhaps the permitting process. Some housing advocates say it's speculation, greed, growth. I'm tired of the fight. Everybody has a valid point if you listen closely, but we're not solving the problem. And as we fight amongst ourselves, the problem is getting worse. It is time to work together, transcend our ideologies, and come up with a new solution. There's a way to do it. About a decade ago in Florida, they were in a similar situation. Local communities were trying to tackle the affordable housing problem. Working people were having a very hard time buying that first home. Activists and industry lobbyists were at war with each other. Same old story. What did they do? Well, they actually worked it out in as progressive a place as Florida. Lawton Chiles, the late governor of Florida, sat the sides down, and they agreed on something called the Sadowski Act. It created a housing trust fund financed by a real estate transfer fee, which in Florida they actually call a documentary stamp tax. As part of that deal, the cities agreed to look at the things they do that raise the cost of housing. And 10 years later, the Florida Association of Realtors and the Home Builders Association support the effort. It's probably not hard to figure out why in retrospect. The programs work, and the members have made a lot of money implementing them. Since 1992 in Florida, 87,000 families have been assisted with affordable homeownership or rental housing. The fund has created $2.4 billion in public and private sector investments. It's smart, it's efficient, and it does a very good job of leveraging money. We could and must take a similar approach here. And I think luckily for us, we're on track, although you may not know it from how things are sounding today. We have a wonderful legacy that Gretchen Kafori left us, getting moving on this issue and calling us to arms. And in the last couple of years, Multnomah County Chair Diane Lynn led a 3-year effort to write a regional strategy. She worked with housing advocates, business leaders, and local elected officials. That strategy would make us a national leader. It's regional, it brings the suburbs and the city together if we implemented it, funded it. We also have unprecedented, you may not know this, terrific leadership in the suburbs right now. Mayor Rob Drake of Beaverton and Mayor Chuck Becker of Gresham are actually the co-chairs of the organization that was mentioned earlier, Oregon Home. We have suburban mayors stepping forward and saying we need to put a new funding mechanism in place and do affordable housing throughout the region. It's extraordinary. Oregon Home asked the 2001 state legislature for the authority to create a regional housing trust fund. We're preempted from creating one by state law. This fund would have been financed by a modest fee like it was in Florida, on the order of 3/4 of 1 point, a little less than 1 percentage point, on real estate transfers. In 10 years using this approach, we would house 10,000 low-income families, and we would create 7,500 new homeowners. Each public dollar would leverage about $3 of private sector investment. In 10 years, that regional fund, if we had the political courage to do it, would create at least $2 billion in new investment, close to $1 billion of that in new construction, and $70 million in new real estate commissions alone. That means jobs, lots of jobs. Corporate loan officers, mortgage brokers, real estate agents, appraisers, escrow officers, plumbers, framers, you get the idea. We made this argument to the legislature, and the leadership acquiesced to a knee-jerk reaction from industry lobbyists for the realtors and the home builders. The bankers were on the fence. This time around, we need to come together, not point fingers, and talk substance. The industry opposition to a trust fund doesn't stand up to economic analysis. In good times, reinvesting a small amount of the wealth derived from real estate will create more homeowners, which creates wealth up and down the ladder, and it will help the poor who have frankly been left behind. In bad times, the trust fund will soften the recession and stimulate the regional economy. It's a very simple investment strategy. It worked in Florida, and it'll work here. We should not let our fights and our ideology stand in the way of some great opportunities. I am ready and willing, and hope each of you are, to work with your industries, with realtors, home builders, legislators, activists, officials, to make an effort like this a model public-private partnership. Nobody in this room should rest until we truly fund the problem of affordable housing. In Oregon, we're independent thinkers, and I believe we have a history of coming together to solve problems. It's our heritage. Our spirit has risen above so many problems in the past and saved us from intractable things that plague other places. I believe solutions to affordable housing should be the next chapter in the Oregon story. And I think the Oregon story will change a lot if it's not. If we do it now, I'm positive in 20 years we'll look back and I wonder what took us so long. It's within our grasp. It's time to step out of these old assumptions, stop fighting long enough to listen to each other for just a minute, and act with the courage of our moral convictions and some clear analysis of just simple economics. The private sector can solve this problem if the government does its part, creates the tools, and works in concert with each of you. It's the community's choice. The answers are there. I hope you will join me in making them reality.
Mr. Chair, I'm afraid that as parliamentarian, I have to report a procedural irregularity with the vote. I am informed that with the confusion of the hands going up and down 3 times, staff misreported the vote, the first vote, and in fact, the motion to substitute the minority report failed. Based on this, the second vote was then made with the membership in error about what they are voting on. And my recommendation, Mr. Chair, is that that vote should be declared null and void and should be taken again.
Very well.
That's what I thought. That's right. Yeah.
All right. Let there be a vote by raising your cards if you've not spindled or destroyed them.
And I should just clarify, Mr. Chair, the vote would now be to accept the majority report.
To accept the majority report as it stands. Those in favor of accepting the majority report as it stands, show your cards, please. Those opposed to acceptance of the report, it is clearly carried that the report is adopted with the majority report. Thank you very much.
Fred.
Eric, I'd like to follow up with your wonderful suggestion and ask what are we going to do in the short term about getting some more funding to the folks who need it the most.
Unfortunately, in the short term, there aren't great options. We've been putting a lot of the city's general fund into housing dollars for the last 10 years, or actually the last 6 or 7 years, and this year we're basically cutting so many programs, and housing never actually made it into the budget as a permanent item. It's kind of a one-time item, and it's back on the theme that we treat it like charity. It's kind of what we do after everything else is done. So essentially, I think really what we can do in the short term is push the city and county essentially not to cut budgets as much as possible because you're not going to see an addition. I want to be blunt about that. Same with the state. There is a proposal in Congress right now that actually is beginning to look like it has some legs to create a National Housing Trust Fund, and particularly Senator Smith could be very important in this, and he's shown some interest in perhaps co-sponsoring it, and so that would be one short-term piece. But other than that, it's mostly at this point going to be arguing not to be cut so much as we're in that kind of mode.
I'm Fred Rosenbaum. I'm a member of the City Club. First of all, Mr. Tillett, I want to extend to you appreciation and to everybody at the head table for the wonderful leadership the club has given this community, particularly as it relates to public housing, going back to the 60s. If it wouldn't be for this club, there would not be the public housing that you see today. And as an isolated case, certainly not a whole thing, I point at the Hillsdale Housing Project, which is the greatest racist, economic, social opposition. You thought you were with the Ku Klux Klan in Alabama. So I want to thank you, this organization, a committee that worked on this, as well as the League of Women Voters and the Urban League and the Rotary and a whole lot of other organizations which gave life to public housing in the city after a history of discrimination and all kinds of other bad things. Having said that, I like your comments, Commissioner Sten. The community is here, and I would ask you again, sir, take the leadership for the community and get public housing back on the track. We need it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Owen.
Erwin Mandel. Whoops. The gremlin seems to have hit this as well. Erwin Mandel, committee member. For Commissioner Sten, you seem, confused me a bit in your comments. You seem to mix up home ownership and housing. The great need is for housing. The committee made a clear distinction and dealt with multiple dwellings rather than home ownership. I'm confused. A $3,000 tax abatement doesn't seem to be very much for someone earning $10,000 a year or less. I don't think that would quite work out. It seems to me, and perhaps other members of the committee, the more money we put into producing home ownership for a relative few, the fewer funds that are available for multiple dwelling and people who need the housing. The immediate need is we have many people lacking adequate housing, some lacking virtually any housing at all. And yet, it seems to me the drive towards home ownership is contradictory to the very needs that we have come upon. Would you comment on that, please?
Well, it's a good question, and it really depends on kind of the breadth and length of our vision as a community. I think right now, as Housing Commissioner, I support and implement funding recommendations that basically put all of the city's money into affordable rental housing, and in the last couple of years, we've pushed the income levels that we'll support down because we've come to the conclusion that we're basically in a rationing mode. I'm arguing in my talk that there's a structural way to solve this problem, which is to tap some of the engine of real estate that goes on in this country through a small fee on real estate transactions, reinvest that back into the community on a regular basis. If you had a permanent source of money that was robust, if you did 3/4 a point, and the percentage with which you levy the fee can be debated. I'm not saying that that's exactly right. That would be $50 million a year. I would recommend, and I think Oregon Home would as well, that's not an extraordinary number, but it would get a ton of leverage, that if you had that, you take about, now you're talking about a completely different discussion than how do we take a nickel and split it up among people who need $1. I would take personally about 1/3 of that and put it into first-time buyer programs because I think they will create more stability and wealth over time. I would then take 2/3 of that and put it into low-income rentals. But I'm talking about a program that's got enough to do both. If you don't address the shrinking home ownership rate, the pressure on the bottom is going to get worse. But I would not argue for just doing home ownership. What I wanted to illustrate, though, is that I think if you had a long-term, permanent, structural source of funds that actually got private sector activity flowing and was predictable, and you could sell bonds against a permanent source and things like that, that you then want to take on both the problem of the shrinking home ownership market and the problem of the very poor, and you'd be out of this horrible kind of dilemma of, do you take families back into the economic mainstream by helping them with home ownership, or do you abandon the poor, which is a choice we should not settle for?
Bill Connor, I was the research advisor for the committee. The report has a lot of things that haven't been discussed. There are a lot of challenges, and I urge you to gather those challenges. One of them that needs to be re-emphasized is challenge number 3, can need be reduced by increasing income? Isn't this the matrix of the problem? People in poverty have increased more than 2 times in the past 20 years, as the report indicates. We need to have what the Nixon administration suggested, only mildly, but they did suggest under Moynihan's urging, a national family income. We need to increase the income of people who are poor so that they can then afford the housing that they deserve. We need to use the Band-Aid approaches that have been mentioned, but I think unless we get at the fact that our society is 2 cultures, the rich and the poor, and we're increasing the poor and increasing the rich, and we have to really solve that problem. I'd like to ask the panelists what they think of that solution, and would you advocate a national income policy for families so that people could afford housing?
Yes, I agree. I would advocate for that, but I thought you wisely in your report said you weren't going to take on the whole issue of income, because I think then you're taking on the restaurateurs, you're taking on a lot of people if you're going to at least raise our minimum wage. And I would just say, you know, a personal story, I had my first apartment in Portland in 1967. I was working as a nurse's aide, just to tell you how the housing climate has changed and that you could live well on a minimum wage in Portland in 1967. I had my first spacious one-bedroom apartment. I paid $60 a month. I worked as a nurse's aide at Good Samaritan. My apartment was kitty corner from the hospital. I made $400 a month. And it was a nice apartment. Today, that same job pays $1,000, and I paid 15% of my income for rent. Today, that same job pays $1,126 a month, minimum wage, and the same apartment rents for $675 a month. The person pays 60% of their income. Of course, they could get a smaller apartment, but I think in one generation, That could be my sons in that job, they're 26, and in that apartment. So I think that's another debate for City Club, and I would recommend you get somebody like Phil Geffner, who's the co-owner of Escape from New York Pizza, and he'll tell you how he's a successful business owner and pays much better than a minimum wage. It's a big topic.
Yeah, I guess I would say quickly that, I'm 100% for trying to help people with skills and get higher wages and support minimum wage increases on a regular basis. I think, and this is what I'm trying to argue, I think you have a structural problem that if wages go up, housing prices are going to go up too, because the tax structure is set up so that people in the middle class who own a home get a huge break that's much bigger than the low income. And so you have to put some sort of structural fix back into the housing market to offset what government policy has done to date, or else incomes alone will drive the price of housing up at the same time. So you have to fix the housing problem at the same time. For people who are unemployed, I think it's absolutely an income issue. For people who are working, and could be working, but for people who are working, you've got a structural problem that's got to be addressed as well as an income issue.
There's no doubt that it's kind of a chicken and egg, income or housing. One could argue that if you have stable, affordable housing, it helps you then have some stability to move on and try to get a better job. But if you're scrambling around trying to find a place to rent all the time, it's hard to focus on other needs. Both are needed.
Just for the panel, I have a question about migrant housing and whether or not any of your regional funds tackle that problem, or whether you could just give us a quick summary of how your agencies have worked with other agencies that are involved with that.
Migrant farm housing is, migrant worker housing is a terrible problem in our community. Peter Paulson, and I might say, I've been at Northwest Pilot Project for 17 years. I've only been the director for 15. Peter Paulson, the founder of Northwest Pilot Project and its first director for 18 years, has been involved with groups that are working very hard on migrant farm worker housing. Peter, would you stand up? Go talk to Peter Paulson after this and find out how you can get involved in what the groups are doing. It's a tough, tough issue, and there are groups in this community who are working very hard on it.
And just briefly, I would say the Oregon Home approach that business and some of the electeds are working on throughout the region, part of, I think, one of the changes in terms of recommendations, although we're not doing it yet in the last couple of years, is that a trust fund approach should be regional so that we can also put opportunities for affordable housing throughout the region. And I think as the region began to get some of the tools that Portland has, Portland's really the only place doing major affordable housing development. I think migrant housing would rise to the top very, very quickly. And part of the reason for the regional approach, of course, is that the disparity of housing prices throughout the region, perhaps, and I see Ray Polani coming up, could have more to do with our congestion problems than a lot of other things. So if we could disperse housing for all income people throughout the region, I think we'd have a different land use problem facing us. We still have problems, but they'd be different.
Ray Polani, a City Club member. It was mentioned that it is an income problem, but it is also a land use problem. I think the problem is the concentration of automobiles and people in the same place. We are underusing, we're overusing the land and underutilizing the land to house automobiles and move automobiles. I think we need to pay attention to that. 40% of the land is probably devoted to the automobile in some way or another. I think we should pay some attention to funding stably and progressively better transit so that it can have an alternative. That way we will have more income and better utilization of the land. What is the panel idea?
I think that is an important issue. There are a lot of regional issues about where jobs and housing are located. I think it is important, and there are actually 4 housing authorities, for instance, that offer rent assistance in the metropolitan area. And we do try to cooperate so that it's easy if you have a rent assistance, or it's easier if you have rent assistance to be able to move closer to where you work. But there's no doubt that there is a huge interaction between where people live and where people work in terms of transportation costs in the region.
My observation about transportation, I've always said, I think affordable housing advocates are afraid of big numbers. We're afraid of $500 million. We weren't afraid to spend $100 million on one light rail stop on the West Side Light Rail to build the stop at the zoo, which I support. I think light rail is great. I think we should have tunneled down and spent $100 million. But I mean, I think we've done that with transportation. I think we've spent beaucoup bucks on transportation. Now we're doing housing along those transit lines. We need to treat housing the way we've treated transportation, as infrastructure. And we need to not be afraid to say, it's going to cost $500 million. It's going to cost $1 billion. We're going to put a price tag on it. We're going to give all these people in the room, Reach Community Development, the Housing Authority of Portland, they're raring to go. I mean, these groups have the technical skills. Let's get them the money, and let's do for housing what we've done for transportation. Calls me about the light rail stuff.
Susan, while you're on a roll, can I ask you to answer the question?
Yeah, I'm not sure. The question that was specifically for me, Susan Emmons, if someone can get a one-bedroom apartment in Portland for $695, why is the retired veteran you mentioned paying almost $500 for one room? Well, he has a pension. He only gets $796 a month. And their guidelines for income to rent. And so most landlords won't let you pay 100% of your income for rent. They want you to have twice or 3 times. You know, they'll cut them off and they'll amend them in some of these residential hotels. So $695 a month for a veteran who's earning $796 definitely wouldn't work. And I think that's one of our problems. And all I was trying to illustrate with that is we have people in minimum wage. Many of them might be your 20-somethings who are coming home from college and living in your house again because they can't get a job that will pay for their rent. So I think it's difficult, and I think, you know, if you push the people who are paying the entry-level jobs, I mean, the largest job growth in the state right now are jobs that pay less than $20,000 a year. So, you know, are we building housing for the people in the largest job growth sector? I mean, are all our things tying together?
My question has to do with building in affordable housing as housing is being built. And I'm interested in how the panel would think about requiring developers and communities in the metropolitan area to take their fair share of affordable housing through design modifications, smaller units, and other such things so that they're truly affordable built in as you create new housing.
I think that's an excellent question. I'm so glad you asked that. I sit in the audience at the Portland Development Commission meetings, and I saw the fellow present on the Blitz-Weinhard project when they were first getting going and getting approval for the, you know, significant public subsidy that was going to go in to make that happen, an exciting project. And I thought at the time, I wonder if anybody at PDC has approached this guy who looked like a good guy and say, how about doing in all that huge complex 20 studio apartments that would rent for $250 a month for the seniors that are in my lobby, who would fit well in there. Just a little retooling, a little efficiency. I mean, has anyone even asked him? So I actually think people would come forward. They do their civic duty if you put it and framed it for them, but I don't think we're even asking them.
Susan's on a bit of a roll, so I actually, if we stay longer, it's going to get really fun, believe me. That's a really good question, Kurt. You know, this whole notion of inclusionary zoning, which is done a lot of times in growth communities, has been proven successful. It's not necessarily for very low income because, frankly, there is some subsidies needed. The report goes into depth about just construction costs and how do you pay for it. But in terms of moderate income housing, in our local region, we have been unable to kind of move that agenda forward. Clearly, as a cost of doing business, if people are going to make money doing market rate housing, they could include some affordable housing without subsidy. In terms of with subsidy, I think this city is really exploring a variety of new techniques, including rent assistance project-based, that really can help with real mixed income developments.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, I think the notion of trying to get affordable housing built into the mainstream, built into each building, built throughout the region. I mean, you can look at it through different increments, built in different parts of the city, is clearly the right policy. There's been a lot of debate about whether or not we should try and mandate that. It's a pretty tricky business to mandate it, and I think there's no question we should ask everybody who's doing it to take part and try and find good ways to do it. If you did mandate it, it would get to a relatively small number of units on the big scale of things, but it might be good. I've taken the position with the industry who's adamant that we shouldn't mandate it, that the only way you get around that kind of work is to try and do something proactive, you know. And I think right now what you hear is well, if you just had stricter regulations, maybe that would solve the problem. It won't solve the problem, and I haven't supported inclusionary zoning for that reason. At some point, if you can't get any traction at all about where we're going to find some money to invest, then you start falling into those kind of things. Well, I'd rather mandate 20 units than get nothing. But I think it alone is pretty unlikely to solve the problem, and that's why I'm really trying to send out a call to the greater community to say, let's see if we can agree on something much larger in scale, much more proactive than trying to force it. But I think the notion through policy and incentives of trying to get affordable housing everywhere and investing to get that affordable housing everywhere is really smart, and probably the biggest mistake we've made as a community over the last 100 years that we've been building the city is not putting it everywhere.
This will be our last question.